Well, welcome back, everyone. This is now our fourth and final panel before the closing remarks and open conversation. My name again is Muhammad Khalil. I'm the director of the Muslim Studies program, and we have a very interesting panel to conclude the conference. We have a total of five presenters, or five authors of papers, but four presenters. And we'll begin right away with the first person listed, and that is Professor Russell Lucas. So Russell E. Lucas is an associate professor of international relations in James Madison College and of global studies in the College of Arts and Letters at Michigan State University. His research specializes on Middle Eastern politics, and his current research focuses on conceptions of public opinion in the Arab world and on the politics of Arab monarchies. He teaches classes on the politics and culture of the Middle East, as well as theories of global studies. He has previously served as the director of the Global Studies in the Arts and Humanities. He's also one of my colleagues here at Michigan State. And the title of his presentation is Misrepresenting Arab Public Opinion, Polls or Phobias. Again, each presenter will have 15 minutes, and at the end we will have Q&A. I encourage you to type in your questions in the Q&A, and with that, I'll turn it over to Professor Lucas.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Professor Khalil, Professor Lajevardi. I wanted to thank you all for inviting me to the conference. I also have to, well, actually, I should probably start sharing my screen now, shouldn't I? Wanted to also thank James Madison College for supporting the project. And especially, I think this couldn't have happened without the help of three student assistants. I didn't peek too much into the participant list to see if they're here. And that is Ahmed Abdurrahman from James Madison College, Cassia D'Angelo from the College of Social Science, and Jillian Riney, also from James Madison College. They've been doing a lot of the legwork on this project. And so what I'd like to do today is share some preliminary results of the project. And so I'm interested in comments from my fellow panelists and from the audience as to how we move forward. So I want to have the caveat that these are preliminary results of our look into public opinion and public opinion polling as it's covered in the media. And so our project began with a fairly notable use and abuse of public opinion polling in the British press from the British newspaper The Sun from 2015. That the point was their headline, as you can see, the shocking poll that 1 in 5 British Muslims have sympathy for jihadis was forced to be retracted because of the British Independent Press Standards Organization. And so they had to, this happened in March 2016 after over 3,000 complaints about the article. And so what happened here? Well, first of all, obviously the headline, and then as you dig into the article itself, there's a lot of issues with this article. And first of all, when we're looking at numbers, well, okay, 71% of the people polled had no sympathy for young Muslims who leave the UK to fight in Syria. And so instead of focusing on the 71%, they were focusing on the 5% plus 14%. What does sympathy mean? Well, okay, how is this question interpreted by the poll respondents as compared to by the authors of the article is actually quite different. And also inaccuracy in kind of joining fighters in Syria as compared to becoming a jihadi. These two things were aligned with one another from the front page into the text and in the poll. And so, all of these inaccuracies were out there, and kind of prompted some thinking as I'm doing research on public opinion about how these polls in the Middle East get used. And so this is part of, kind of a larger question of the globalization of public opinion research, especially as it's moving more and more into use in the Middle East. And so, building off of kind of a lot of research by friends and colleagues like Mark Tesler at the University of Michigan, Amani Jamal at Princeton University, and a whole host of pollsters in the United States, Europe, and especially those in the Middle East who are working on developing the Arab Barometer and implementing the Arab Barometer polls. But the idea here is that, of course, surveys turn words into ideas into numbers. And so without getting into a lot of detail here, polling in the Middle East has really taken off in the past 2 decades. As authors like Tesler and Jamal are, using public opinion to use social science to kind of work against essentialism and Orientalism, and to try to create more accurate representation of values and attitudes, and allowing a more objective way for people to speak for themselves. And of course, academics aren't the only ones engaged in this. Prominent think tanks and cross-national survey research institutes are as well. But this also leads us to a second set of literature that looks at public opinion not as just a social fact, but also as that those numbered voices do not just speak for themselves. In the words of authors like Susan Herbst or Justin Lewis, and I think Lewis is a very big inspiration for this project, is that polling really only reaches the public through the media. And so there is this layer of mediation. And so public opinion polling really only discusses things that are politically relevant, especially to the elites. And so I'm happy to talk about some of these theoretical origins of the project a little bit more if people are interested. But that gets us into kind of how media works and how polling works and how those two things kind of start mixing with one another. And in this, I'm using a simplified model of Stuart Hall's circuit of culture that focuses on the production, the text, and the audience. And of course, in public opinion research, there is likewise a circuit of social science going on, of production and methods, the text, the data analysis, and then the audience, the dissemination of the polling data. And so here we can look at this Sun article in this circuit of media culture and kind of the blurring of lines in the authorship between the journalists and using polling as a journalistic as compared to polling in an opinion article sense, and whether it's being used as reportage or commentary. Secondly, and I think this is where the major issues of that article were, is there was a lack of correspondence between turning the numbers back into words. What was the poll? Was the poll the reason for the report? But it was lacking the accuracy that a poll should be, used for. And then lastly, thinking about the science, and I will keep using science in quotation marks carefully here, that the lack of that science wasn't discussed as well, let alone the misrepresentation of the text itself. I think one of the areas that this project is not going to be able to get into as much is the reception of the audience of these media reports. It's, of course, an important part of this circuit of culture. So that led us to ask kind of a series of empirical questions. as to looking at polling in the Middle East that is reported in the Western press. Who's speaking and where? What are the topics? Is the polling a source or the topic itself? Are these polls being used in the way that authors like Tesler would have it, or more like the authors of the Sun article? In that, and I think fitting in with a lot of other presentation here, looking at the text themselves, how loaded, shall we say, is the language? Is it trying to be neutralistic? Is it positive? Is it negative? Do the headlines and texts match? And is polling as a science being addressed? And so what I'd like to share is some of these preliminary results on this. Our sample draws from the databases of the Nexus Universe, ProQuest US Newsstream, and the Factiva archives, in which we were looking at coverage since 2000 of polls in the Middle East. In the end, just doing a keyword search of poll or survey, of course, picks up in a lot of missed hits. And so therefore we refocused to look at 7 major think tank and academic polling organizations and 8 individual pollsters associated with those organizations. What I'm sharing today is a somewhat first cleaning of the data of 160 news documents, with the caveat that there's still a lot of cleaning of the data. There are intercoder disputes, haven't been fully educated. And so in the end, our results may differ slightly from what we see here today. So let me talk about some of these results here. Only 11% of the articles were authored by a pollster. And so in that, in the red, of course, or where are those that the pollster is the author, and most of those happened in the news reports. Now, also, here's where a little bit of data cleaning needs to happen. Is I have a feeling that as we kind of go article by article through the data, not just looking at them in aggregate, we're going to see more of these news reports shift into the news analysis portion, but obviously the interviews are kind of were fairly obvious. But that said, most of the, most of this is not pollsters speaking on behalf of themselves or writing on behalf of themselves, but rather there is this journalist or other opinion author intervention between the pollsters and the public. In terms of topics, this chart shows that basically the topics tend to follow the major themes of US foreign policy in the 2000s, but actually that perhaps not quite exactly in proportion of what we would see in a broader media coverage, that kind of issues related to more or less the global war on terrorism would have probably received more attention than they did. And the Arab-Israeli conflict perhaps would have received less. Now, these also may be artifacts of our selection criteria, and so it needs a further refinement, but on the other hand, it's not surprising that these are the major topics that, opinions about the United States and views of the United States, kind of how favorably or unfavorably do people view the United States, make up about a quarter of these polls. But I think that the Arab-Israeli conflict is overrepresented, perhaps in relation to the media, does emphasize its importance in the US and European media. That terrorism, ISIS, are underrepresented is interesting. On the other hand, there are also, we do have some data issues in that this isn't able to capture articles that were coded for 2 different topics, for example. So, but just as kind of a general point to be made here. I think the area that probably is the most interest to participants in the audience of this conference is, how is Islam, Muslims, Arabs being represented in the polls themselves, and then in the journalistic coverage of those polls. And so about over half of the articles we've coded so far as being neutralistic, trying to present both sides or kind of an objective point of view. And then a little bit less than a quarter have used language that was explicitly about radicalism, extremism, terrorism, violence, etc. And about 14% were talking about kind of the positive sides of peace, cooperation, tolerance, acceptance. 9% picked up a little bit of both of those two. Caveat of we need to sort out this a little bit further as to, is this the topic of the poll or is this the language used? And then what I think we're going to be doing is moving into kind of cross-tabulating that between particular topics and particular sources. I think a little bit less of interest to this audience, but perhaps to others, is how the data and science are used. Often percentages are discussed, but methods are not. And so that's an important part, I think, in thinking about how polling is used in the media. And so to kind of try to wrap up here, seeing as I'm running out of time, I think our preliminary results indicate that perhaps egregious Islamophobia, if I want to say that, is less apparent than initially feared in the mainstream media. This is, of course, subject to further analysis. Is this radicalism as a topic of the poll, and so therefore kind of moving backwards into the production stage, or is this something that is being highlighted by the reportage? I think this does find support, and I think it fits in with kind of our comments from our previous panel. This coverage in the polling obviously follows US foreign policy concerns over kind of, even though the polls are titled, what do Arabs think? It tends to focus on what Americans think or worried about what Arabs are thinking. That the specificity and science of polling does make these as more seemingly objective points of support for argumentation, but that doesn't just extend into the kind of more widespread discussion of methods in polling. And so I think there's some areas where we are still working to develop this, but I think that's just the summary of our findings, and I'll wrap up now. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Lucas. As I mentioned, we'll save the questions for the end. So now we'll go right ahead to the next presenter, and that is actually we have a co-authored paper by Professor Nazita Lajevardi, whom you should all know by now, and also Caleb Lucas. So Professor Lajevardi, as I mentioned before, is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science. She received her PhD from the University of California, San Diego, her JD from the University of San Francisco School of Law, and her BA from UCLA. And her work focuses mainly on issues related to race and ethnic politics, political behavior, voting rights, and immigration. Caleb Lucas is a PhD candidate in the Department of Political Science and an affiliate of the Social Science Data Analytics Initiative at Michigan State University. His research broadly focuses on how armed actors involved in civil conflicts manage their relationships with non-combatants. He is particularly interested in how these groups use different forms of media and their effect on civilian attitudes. And Caleb will actually be the presenter. And the title of the paper is Shifts in Group Salience and Target Substitution by Far-Right Extremists Explain a Contemporaneous Fall and Rise in Hate Crimes. So with that, I'll turn it over to Caleb.
Thanks very much for that introduction. me go ahead and share my screen. The title has it's a little bit less of a mouthful now. Perfect. And so we have changed that title slightly. We decided we've settled on group salience, inflammatory rhetoric, and the persistence of hate against religious minorities. And again, this is a joint project with Professor Nazita Lajevardi here at MSU, and I'm Caleb Lucas, again, a PhD candidate here. And in this paper, we're interested in whether racial appeals result in long-term hate, or whether their effects fade once they lose or salience, or once their salience in the national conversation decreases. And so sort of more specifically, we're interested in whether hate becomes self-sustaining against specific groups, regardless of their prevalence in national conversations, or does hate drop when salience decreases. And the headline finding in this project is that continued salience is in fact key. A decreased salience of a minority group, religious group, is associated with decreased hate overall. But, and the sort of complication in this paper, and the thing we're really interested in, sort of expanding theoretically, is that extremists appear to switch their target when salience decreases, and they attack a different minority group or different religious group. And so, for some background, unfortunately, it's really difficult to sort of be a part of American fabric of life right now, or observe America and not notice that racial appeals and the intentional stigmatization of minorities is increasing in formal and informal U.S. politics, sort of broadly in American society, particularly in the Trump political era, post 2015, post 2016. There's a lot of research, of course, about this topic that's been observing these trends, a lot of accounts from individuals in the United States as well, of course. We know from a lot of research that the media covers these statements and these tactics disproportionately. And so, of course, over the last couple of years, the US media has sort of been inundated by the statements and things that Trump and individuals associated with his political party in particular have done, and it's sort of consumed the news cycle. And we know that these actions, this rhetoric, influences voter preferences. So we know it matters. We know that when these sort of conversations shift at the national level, they have real substantive and important implications politically, and of course for people personally. And this inflammatory rhetoric, of course, normalizes online bigotry, which we know is increasing, and normalizes offline behavior, things like hate crimes, bias incidents. And so both of these, of course, are on the rise right now in the United States, unfortunately. So this is a backdrop to our study. So concurrent with this, we know that right now extremists are increasingly networking online. We know that these extremists, they receive cues from and they echo the rhetoric of elected officials and the sort of national media, national conversation surrounding minority groups and religious groups more broadly. And online spaces inhabited by these extremists are increasing literally in number. There's a growing number of literal websites and forums, spaces where these individuals can sort of freely inhabit and freely share and discuss their views about racism, sexism, anti-immigrant attitudes, anti-LGBTQ+ attitudes, and even organize offline behaviors that result in, again, hate crimes and bias incidents. Of course, Gab, here's a screenshot from Gab, is well known for this, both for its role in the recent insurrection, the shooting in Pittsburgh, and other incidents as well. 4chan, similarly for quite some time, has been associated with similar actions, the shootings in Oslo, Christchurch, many incidents in the United States. More recently, Parler has sprouted up, and in particular, not given the insurrection, but a similar online space where these extremists can network and freely discuss, share, cultivate their sort of racist and bigoted ideologies. And again, these are associated with a lot of horrifying recent events. So again, we know that this sort of online networking component matters. And so our theory then, moving to our theory, what we're interested in theorizing first is how politicians activate these networks of hate. We know that racial and bigoted rhetoric is increasing. We know that online spaces where individuals that are open to this sort of rhetoric is increasing. And so we're first interested in how sort of the interaction of these two dynamics. And we expect that elected officials and national conversations surrounding minority groups and religious groups can activate these communities with their racial and bigoted rhetoric and the covering and discussion of those sorts of statements. We expect extremists to echo both in word and in deed the things that elected officials are talking about and the way in which the national news covers those statements. And the result of this, our expectation is an increase then in hate speech and hate crimes. And so the sort of complication that we're really interested in is what about deactivating networks of hate? There is a fair amount of work about this activation. But what happens when the conversation shifts, when the salience of a group decreases? And so this is something we thought about a lot less. Decreasing elected officials' rhetoric, the sort of change in the national conversation might lead to an overall reduction in hate speech and hate crimes. You know, we expect that. But we expect among these individuals that hate for others becomes endemic. And that portions of hate networks find a different group then to target both online and offline. So we expect when rhetoric shifts, the national conversation shifts, that individuals respond by sort of substituting their target. And this is sort of a logic that we're proposing, that they sort of redirect their hate and find a different minority group to target. And so the sort of twist then here that we propose is that rhetoric targeted towards one group can lead to the victimization of another group, which unfortunately is an unfortunate finding, but also changes how we expect sort of trends of hate crimes to occur and ways that we should combat the increased bigotry and hateful rhetoric and hate crimes that we do observe in the United States. And so we study this dynamic, this idea of hate activation and target substitution, using hate speech and hate crimes against Muslims and Jews in the United States. These, of course, are two distinct groups that both experience and have experienced extensive discrimination in the United States. The reasons for that discrimination, of course, are rooted in different dynamics. There are different reasons for the discrimination, hate crimes, bias, prejudice that they experience. And so they're not obviously then complementary. They're different groups target them for different reasons. We don't necessarily expect them to be these groups, these individuals, to be natural substitutes. And so to test or to sort of look for evidence of these trends, we collect a fair amount of data, and I'll only share a small portion of it today for the sake of time. We collect, though, all newspapers in the United States that are available on LexisNexis. We compile a number of hate crime databases. We combine databases, hate crimes collected by CARE, by the ADL, by the FBI, of course, CARE, cataloging incidents that target Muslims, ADL, Jews, and FBI sort of hate crimes more broadly. We use search trends that are made public by Google, a variety of social media data, from all posts on Reddit, the universe of posts on Gab, the universe of posts on 4chan, and some information from Twitter. And so we'll sort of touch on most of this data actually today, but we analyze it in a variety of ways. Today, though, I'll share a number of descriptive findings that illustrate the trends that I've detailed today that we find. And so first, we start with looking at this change in focus before the Unite the Right rally that occurred in Charlottesville, Virginia. Of course, these images of individuals that collected in Charlottesville that were rioting for white supremacy and against just society, and individuals in a number of there are a number of identity groups. It was a pivotal moment in sort of American society and the sort of currents of the day. And what's interesting is that here we have plotted, you should be able to see my cursor, we're plotting news articles and Google searches regarding Muslims and white supremacy. And so searches about and news articles about Muslims are here in purple, this top line, and about news articles about white supremacists and white supremacy. And Google searches about white supremacy is visualized here with this red line. And what we observe then is prior to Unite the Right riot, which is shown here with this vertical gray line, there was a clear decrease in searches about Muslims and news articles about Muslims in the months leading up to the protests or the riot. And concurrent with that, there was a shift from this focus on Muslims to this focus on white supremacy, which was sort of the individuals that took part in that riot, that their focus was sort of broadly changing the conversation to sort of hate for minorities and pushing this the idea of white supremacy. And so we sort of look at this decrease and we think, okay, there's a shift in the national conversation. It's a pivotal moment where the mainstream stance of Muslims is decreasing, and people that are espousing sort of outright white supremacy have increased both in the national news and by people doing things like Googling about white supremacy out of curiosity, because they're interested in it, because they're actively trying to learn more about it on the internet. And we observed this a concurrent trend on these social media platforms that extremists and that these bigots inhabit. We look at Gab and 4chan, which we can talk more about in the Q&A if you're interested, but they're spaces in which these groups inhabit, individuals that espouse hateful and bigoted ideologies inhabit. And again, the Unite the Right rally here in this vertical line, we observe leading up to that a clear decrease in the ratio of Muslims to Jewish mentions on these platforms. So a decrease here suggests that there's relatively more mentions of Jews and relatively less mentions of Muslims on these fringe platforms that extremists inhabit. You can observe here at 4chan as well. And so we know then a sizable decline, we see a sizable decline in mentions of Muslims across social media. And that was followed by a shift of mentions to Jews then, in the ratio of mentions, Jews to mentions decreased, leading up to the Unite the Right rally. So then what we need to explore then is, are these changes reflected in offline hate crimes and bias incidents? Was there this target substitution effect that we expect? So here we have the ratio of anti-Muslim to anti-Jewish hate crimes. And so again, a decrease then, this line going down suggests there are relatively more anti-Jewish hate crimes, relatively less anti-Muslim hate crimes. And we do observe, again, around the Unite the Right rally here in gray, that in the months leading up to that rally, there was a decrease in the targeting of Muslims and an increase in the targeting of Jews. And then that is a consistent trend then that we observe. And so share these descriptive findings today. We do have a variety of other analyses that I don't have the time to share, but we think that these are sort of interesting sort of headline findings in our paper. So a quick conclusion, what we find, and like a lot of work, that group salience, inflammatory rhetoric partially drives hate crimes, but continued salience of groups is key. A decreased group salience is associated with overall decrease in hate crimes, but there's this target substitution effect that we propose, where people where a certain subset of these hate networks change the target of their hate, in this case from Muslims to Jews. This underscores the importance of moderating and dismantling these online spaces where hate and bigotry are so common, and provides additional evidence of the negative effects of the racial rhetoric that we see so much. And the damage extends to other minority groups, this sort of complication that we're trying to think deeply about. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Caleb, for a very interesting presentation. Many thanks to you and the co-author, Professor Nazita Lajevardi. Thank you so much. We'll now turn to our next presenter. So I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Sabah Feroz-Uddin, excuse me. Dr. Uddin is an assistant professor in the Department of Language, Literature, and Cultural Studies at Bowie State University. Originally from Toronto, Canada, she earned her BA in Women's Studies from the University of Massachusetts in Boston, and her PhD in Women's Studies from the University of California, Los Angeles. Her scholarly interests range widely from global and post-colonial feminisms, gendered social movements, gender in the Muslim world, migration, South Asian diasporas, feminism and fashion, and gender, culture, and the media. The title of her presentation is British Muslim Self-Making on Social Media, Responding to Islamophobia in Britain. And as a reminder, each presenter has 15 minutes, and then we will take questions. So if you have a question, please feel free to type it in the Q&A. Thank you so much. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Uddin. Oh, you are muted, by the way, Dr. Uddin.
Thank you.
Yes.
You would think I know that by now. So before I start, I did want to say these are sort of reflecting very early findings for a larger project that I'm hoping to continue. So to start, I want to read an excerpt from a poem titled, "This is Not a Humanizing Poem" by Suhaima Manzoor Khan. And this poem went viral in 2017 with more than 60,000 views on YouTube. And so, "This will not be a Muslims are like us poem. I refuse to be respectable. Instead, love us when we're lazy, love us when we're poor, love as high as heights, unemployed, joyriding, time wasting, failing at school, love is filthy. Without the right color passports, without the right sounding English. Love is silent, unapologizing, shopping in Poundland, skiving off school, homeless, unsure, sometimes violent. Love us when we aren't athletes, when we don't bake cakes, when we don't offer our homes or free taxi rides after the event, when we're wretched, suicidal, naked, and contributing nothing. Love us then. And so the question asked by the poet, also known as the brown hijabi, is what does it mean to be a good Muslim in Britain? Drawing attention to the fine line the West draws between what it means to be a good and bad Muslim. This question is not new. In fact, I had attempted to answer it when I conducted my doctoral research in Birmingham, England in 2007, so quite a long time ago. And at the time, I had concluded that by elaborating Islam as incommensurable with British norms and marginalizing those citizens for whom religion is a primary identity, national calls for integration and assimilations of Muslims will continue to go unheard. I had hoped by now, over 10 years later, there had been more significant strides made in addressing how best to integrate Muslim sensibilities into the British public collective. Instead, post-Brexit, where there's been an increased percentage rise of Islamophobic attacks against Muslims in Britain, questions of British Muslim belonging continue to persist. Take, for example, on March 6, 2020, in a tweet announcing his new extended play record and short film titled The Long Goodbye, English Muslim descent actor and rapper Riz Ahmed writes, quote, "My country's broken up with me. We had our ups, but now it's broken down," end quote. This project takes up this sense of fatigue, focusing on how young British Muslims culturally express their social dislocation. In her book, British, author points to the problems of belonging as a, quote, uniquely British problem, end quote. She writes, quote, "We have convinced ourselves that if we can contort ourselves into a form of blindness, then issues of identity will quietly disappear," end quote. However, Hirsch insists, with which I'm inclined to agree, quote, "Threatened identities don't fade away quietly. They become defensive and fight back with new confidence, pride, and desperation," end quote. So this project is not about engaging what Hirsch calls the soothing language of diversity, but instead grapples with the complicated entanglement of social policies, which arguably flattens diversity of an experience and erases complex differences. According to the Office of National Statistics, the most current census shows that approximately 50% of the UK's Muslim population was born in the UK. And yet, in post-Brexit Britain, when addressing the perceived Muslim problem, where the spectacle of young Muslims joining ISIS as foot soldiers or as jihadi brides continues to foreground the collective British memory, British Muslims continue to face accusations of unsatisfactorily responding to the questions of identity, home, and belonging. The public discursive terrain continues to spread moral panic about Muslims as hard to integrate by painting Muslims as one-dimensional, reductive strokes, whereby men are defiant terrorists and women are acquiescent to patriarchy. This project reflects on this notion of failing to fit in with Britishness, and instead explores how young British Muslims are choosing to rebuke this monocultural state approach to diversity. I'll look at how second and third generation Muslims are more vocal, uncompromising, and less afraid to question the intention of the state. I will look at how this young group of Muslims, whom author Shalina Jan Muhammad names Generation M, resist calls to become normal, good Muslims and are less willing to respond to accusations of clashing civilizations. Instead, Generation M seeks to unapologetically assert their particularized racial and religious difference through cultural expressions of dissatisfaction. I'll focus on how young Muslims in Britain are contributing towards a novel culture of British Muslimness, a culture which consciously draws upon divergent strands of cultural practice. I will look at how these young Muslims produce and consume innovative forms of cultural expression, visual art, music, fashion, film, and poetry, and in particular looking at how they interact on digital platforms. So social media, for example, offers a new discursive landscape where British Muslims are actively using aesthetic-driven communities, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, to produce self-expressed visual content. So crafting what author Suad Abdul Khabir terms as a Muslim cool aesthetic, an aesthetic grounded at the intersections of Islam, white Western normativity, and racial and ethnic experience of minority communities. These British Muslims are attempting to make visible what is often rendered invisible. They're actively engaged in Muslim self-making, whereby they seek to avoid casting Muslims on the sidelines, navigating assimilation, but rather privilege British Muslimness and position Muslim Britons as actors whose lives and experiences are critical to the production of a new modernity in Britain. So in terms of like the Brexit response, I don't want to go into like the whole historical response to immigration, but what we do see is there was echoes of that critical response to immigration in Britain after Brexit. And so an example is in his article in the American Conservative titled Unmaking England, author Benjamin Schwartz offers this biting critique of mass immigration in the UK. And so, for example, he looks back at the Black immigrant from Jamaica in the 1950s, and he contends that, quote, "The cultural distance that separates him from a white British native is certainly small, as he is probably Anglican, likely cricket playing, possibly wartime veteran, schooled in England's history and literature," end quote. And so he saves his ire for Muslims in Britain, saying that different cultural and ethnic groups have affected Britain in different ways. End quote. And he particularly accuses Bangladeshis and Kashmiri Pakistanis for not integrating code word Muslim. And he writes, quote, "The Pakistanis and Bangladeshis form a metaphorical foreign encampment rather than an immigrant neighborhood," end quote. And so for the sake of time, I will not belabor this point, but Schwartz's argument is not a one-off opinion, but rather with the rise of Islamophobia, these ideas of national identity and belonging continue to embroil public policy debates in Britain, returning always to the question of assimilability of Muslims. So in terms of my dissertation findings over 10 years ago, I had looked at these very question of home, belonging, and integration of British Muslims. And at that time, I had argued, they were producing a more complex form of belonging. And I thought it was moving in a very positive direction in terms of integration. However, what my research is now showing is that despite this move, nothing has really changed in the cultural and racial politics in Britain. And so I return to my earlier questions now through a lens that's more relevant today. I believe it's more important to explore the relationship between visual culture and power and how it circulates and creates meaning, in particular in digital media, by showing how useful social media platforms are in providing a space for countercultural contestations and discourse through their own forms of expression. So I'm just going to share my screen for once in a second to kind of just talk about some of the forms of expression that young British Muslims are engaging in on a few digital sites. Oops, sorry, let me just share my screen. Okay. So you can see here, there are just a few examples. One example, the first one is that I had kind of mentioned before, is Riz Ahmed. And notwithstanding his recent Oscar nomination, he released an earlier referenced album called The Long Goodbye, which he dedicates to his emotional breakup with Britain. The album was accompanied with an 11-minute short film by the same title, which could be found on YouTube. And it follows the life of a British South Asian family as they prepare for a wedding, when suddenly a group of white supremacists break into their home, drag them into the streets, and execute them. The family pleads for help as white neighbors look on in concern, but do not intervene. Through a combination of rap and spoken word overlaying the film, Ahmed describes the brutal reality for people of color living in a xenophobic post-Brexit Britain. And he says in an interview with British Vogue, quote, "I wanted to talk about how it feels to be here in England. It feels heartbreaking, man. It feels enraging. It feels like it's not real. When you're in a relationship, sometimes you're looking for someone else to validate you. And when you're rejected, you internalize the idea that you aren't worth anything. I'm feeling rejected by Britain, but I'm effing British. I'm Britain. So evaporating the illusion of duality is really empowering," end quote. And so some of the other ones we've got here, some artists, some feminist artists who are really trying to, what they say is gain visibility and taking control of the gaze. Oops, sorry. This is another one. Sophia Nazi, she really wants to talk about how Muslim women, she wants to talk about how that, she says, I quote, I hope more people would understand racism as a technology and turn the heat on racist, anti-Black people and Islamophobes to try and figure out why they're so trash and garbage, instead of trying to understand Muslims and pathologize Muslim women. Another one, These Group is a comedy troupe that you can find on YouTube and Instagram, and they kind of take on questions that non-Muslims ask and kind of spin it in a more sort of comedic way. So some of the questions they ask are, do your parents stone you when you're bad? Men by women, that's the marriage process. Why are Muslims so scared of pigs? And then there's this Twitter hashtag that went, and I'll talk about it in a second, which was what British Muslims really think. And they kind of posted memes or responses to it. So, this cat will be profiled at the airport, what British Muslims think, hashtag, why couldn't Halal Haribo be around when I was in school? This whole beard thing lately, that was us, right? Okay, so these are kind of a little bit of some of the examples. I don't want to belabor this. And then let me just kind of talk a little bit of the conclusions that I can draw from this work. First, I'd like to kind of revise my current title, British Self-Making, because this implies that there's something new that's occurring. British Muslim media, TV and magazines have long provided an alternative to mainstream outlets. However, what is new is the way digital media does politics in the mainstream. Now there's this act of talking back. It does not operate in the parallel, but rather expands the existing space to create new communities and engage in communal activism across borders. It is what authors Nisbet and Myers call, quote, a symbolic space not necessarily bounded by traditional national borders, end quote. And so further, the space provides the flexibility to find creative ways to subvert dominant discourse through both language and visual images. And so what the above examples of work bring into view is how digital media culture producers are aligning their activity with activism to contest structural norms in geopolitics. The digital platform is now combining personal and political through digital storytelling, something that was not very visible before. So drawing a parallel, I refer to the work on authors Bonilla and Rosa, who study digital protest around the Ferguson shooting of Michael Brown. And they write, quote, whereas in face-to-face interactions, racialized young people might not be able to contest the meanings ascribed to their bodies, through their creative interpretations on social media, they were able to rematerialize their bodies in alternative ways, end quote. So in a similar function, British Muslims are calling into question established practices, which using Saskia Warren's framing of Islamophobia, which works to, which is kind of violence that places limits on social and physical mobility, young Muslims creatives are exercising critical agency over the construction circulation of their own narratives, whereby they disrupt a normative, hierarchical, and dominant white spaces. So Saskia Warren calls this articulation ruptural politics. They are not so much interested in negotiation, but rather they rest comfortably as being situated as the, quote, difficult or unpredictable other. So for example, in a recent Instagram story, Mariah Adrisi, best known as the first hijabi model, pronounces her 92,000 followers that, quote, I believe that it is our responsibility as the African diaspora or the South Asian diaspora to complete the mission of building back home. By underscoring back home, Idrisi consciously complicates the notion of home for British-born Muslims, further reinforcing the conservative criticisms that from immigrants, the UK is a temporary home for economic benefit with a larger goal of ultimately returning home. In a follow-up post months later, she screenshots the text, oppression comes in many forms. She follows with, our Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, sent his followers to Abyssinia when they were being oppressed in Mecca. His lives and teachings were an example for us. Then she asked the question, time to make hijrah? Hijrah meaning migration, Idrisi leaves it up to her followers to decipher the coded meanings behind her post. Idrisis and others like her are talking back, using the social media interactions to both contest social discrimination and marginalization and further their British Muslim collective identity. And I'll just give one more example. The hashtag What British Muslims Really Think was launched in April 10, 2016, and it was a response to a magazine cover on the Sunday Times magazine with the headline, What Do British Muslims Really Think? And the headline accompanied an article entitled Inconvenient Truth, which was really talking about how British Muslims are fundamentally different than other British people. And so this hashtag was intended to use by members of the British Muslim online community to share their version of what British Muslims really think, and thereby deride the negative portrayal within the article. And so what is clear from these shared responses is the hashtag is the group identity embraced the difference, and they sort of were instead established and promoted an unproblematic sameness around British Muslimness, and they had no imperative to perform Britishness itself. And so this performative discourse enabled British Muslims to destabilize dominant ideologies about themselves and question the validity of authority, this sort of affirmative self-identification. They were able to talk back and also kind of be able to identify as with a notion of agency. So I'll just conclude here. So as I noted at the start of this paper, this larger project is evaluating the cultural politics of self-assertion. And I'm still haven't figured out whether it can actually, by redefining and reproducing one's own cultural narratives, can it address the social tensions and can it mark critical change? But I am left with this one. It was a podcast called Brown Baby, and they were talking about racism, how to raise children in England that are not racist. And one of the hosts reflects on a quote, why must the oppressed be called upon to comment on their oppressors? Ask the oppressors to hold themselves accountable. And he says, imagine what work we could create if we weren't always having to do social commentary. And so with this, I wonder, can Muslims move beyond this familiar fighting for space and always responding to criticism of difference and instead just be understood? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Adine, for a very interesting presentation. And now we will proceed to our final presenter. So last but certainly not least is Felipe Freitas de Souza. Felipe is a PhD student in social sciences. He received a master's degree in technological education. He researches Islamophobia in social networks. He is a member, which is an acronym for Group of Anthropology in Islamic and Arab Contexts, and NAPE, which is the Center for Anthropology of Image and Performance. And the title of Felipe's paper is Islam on the Brazilian Timeline, Islamophobia in a Social Network. So with that, I'll turn it over to Felipe.
Hi, good morning, good evening, and good night. And assalamu alaikum for those Muslim brothers and sisters, because it's, as a Brazilian, I must say that I'm very happy to be in a conference like that, because it's very hard to have Muslims and people from Muslims background doing research and showing the researches in a context like that. And it's a challenge to be the last one to talk after so many very good presentations and lectures. And maybe I hope to show some stuff that I find out in my research. I started my doctorate the last year, just before the COVID pandemic starts, and then I'm researching this subject for 1 year, and there are a lot of developments that I must do and I wish to do before the end of the thesis. But I'm very happy to share some findings of the research of this ongoing research. So as Professor Mohammed Khalil told, my research was on Islamophobia in social media. The media that I chose to do this research is Twitter, because of some familiarity, and after Twitter took a margin of representation, like no other social media took, first of all because of President Trump, and in Brazil for President Jair Bolsonaro. And one of them was national populists, and they use this social media a lot. So it's not a very difficult choice to find this kind of representations of Muslims, because there is something that I talk ahead in my presentation about the people that publishes Islamophobia on this platform. Most of them was Christians and right-wing people that sympathizes with Jair Bolsonaro's government and the other people in the government. So they have a posture around Islam that took Islam as something exotic, as something alien to Brazilian background. And I discovered that most of people don't know that there are Muslims in Brazil. There are a community of the Muslims Federation of Brazil tell about 1.5 million Muslims in Brazil. Field anthropologists talk about 300, less 500,000 Muslims, and it's a debatable number. But in any way, there are Muslims in Brazil and spread around the country. So taking on my presentation. First of all, I apologize because I have a problem with the archive, but I read some part of it, and I'll make comments as I read the archive. Despite the existence of few studies in Islamophobia in Brazil, there are reports of attacks against members of Brazilian Muslim communities. The studies of Islamophobia in Brazil is something recent. We have a few researchers doing the job. We have the first project on a university was approved last year, and mine is maybe the first doctorate on the subject. And unfortunately, it's a team that we have a lot to research in Brazil. And it's not stable that social agents propagate negative representations about Islam and its followers via social networks. Such representations are organized in species that manifest the foundations of Islamophobia, being disseminated with each publication on social network that reduces the discussion about Islam to a stance of us against them, using stereotypes. It's common for Muslims to be portrayed as a group without variations and the savage, barbarians, misogynists, and enemies of modernity. So it's common to get this this kind of representation. That's something it's globally spread, as we saw in the lectures before, the presentations before, and it's something that happens in Brazil also. Even if you have a little Muslims on media, and even in social network, and it's this kind of hierarchical values of people, that a white person with a Christian background, with a heterosexual orientation, with that is not handicapped. It's a perspective that that the national populism that rose in Brazil, that spread in Brazil, makes sense for them to that Muslims was in the bottom of this hierarchy. The Muslims cannot be Brazilians. It's also common that people ask for Muslims in Brazil where they come from, even if we're Brazilians that choose to follow Islam. It's a common answer that I have to. There's a common question that I have to answer, even if I born a kilometer from the house that I live in here. And as a Brazilian, it's a choice that is very strange for people to be made, because of this aspect of alien Muslims, because of the aspects of the Muslims as aliens to Brazilian background. So it's common, for example, to have something that was said before about the presence of Muslims in the United States from African that comes through that was enslaved and took to United States. It's something close of that happens in Brazil, because the first Muslims here were from African background also, and come to Brazil on an slave condition. And then we have the Arabic diaspora, and it's common to refer to Brazilians it's common to refer to Syrian, to Palestine, and Lebanese people as with the same word as Turks, and it's common to call them all Turks, as that there's no ethnical background, and it's a kind of erasure of this background to be assimilated in society within a stereotype as Turks. And by the way, it's something that still happens here, and there is very bad misrepresentations and stereotypes about this Arabic people with Arabic background, just told before on Islamophobia. Even if you have a president as Michel Temer, he was his family is from Syria. The second candidate on the electoral process that elected Jair Bolsonaro, his name was Fernando Haddad. And we have a very famous corrupt politician here, and his name is Maluf. And we have this relations of politicians, and it's something that they're from Christian background, and something paradoxical, because in a sense you have some person from backgrounds that make reference to Islamic, to Muslim background, but there is still a perception that they are not from Brazil. And you have some conspiracy theories that even spread in social media around these figures. Continuing, we are interested in investigating these representations and how they are presented on social network. As a strategy, we start by looking at publications close to trigger events, which are negative events involving Muslims, and which are followed by publications about Islam and Muslims, mainly events involving the actions of Muslim extremists. Trigger events have proved fruitful in the observation of Islamophobic publications when an international event occurs, which has repercussions on social networks beyond national and linguistic borders. Hundreds of Brazilian accounts on the observed social network manifest themselves in a negative way on Islam and Muslims. So, as a way to think about the specificities of Brazilian Islamophobia, I use this method of observation on the social network and to observe the trigger events to observe some events as trigger events of these publications have been productive, because you find out a lot of publications involving Muslims and Islam. And for example, I took the attacks on Charlie Hebdo as a trigger event to analyze. And the hashtag operation, I don't know if everyone know about this operation that arrested a group of Brazilian Muslims in Brazil just before the Olympics, and as an aspect that police took as an indice of radicalization, is that a person of this group have 10 Qurans at his shelf. So it's a curious aspect of radicalization to have books in our house. But as I told before, we have this trigger events as aspects to think in Islam, about Islamophobia in Brazil, because we don't have, as I told, a big community. So everything that happens around the world echoes in Brazilian social media, and it's very common that something happens in the United States, or something happened in Lebanon, and then people start to talk about the Brazilian community as there's something, some connection between these communities, and it's like a guilty that we share even if we don't know each other. It was Muslims from different backgrounds, from different countries, but in the imaginary of the people that publishes in social media, there are relations. A Muslim cannot be a real Brazilian, for example. It's as I told before, the question of the hierarchy, and to be a real citizen in Brazil, you must be Christian, you must be white, you must practicing evangelic, and it shows a difficult context to live with other religions. It's not like people that follows Candomblé, Umbanda, and other religions of people of saints in Brazil, but it's because they show some domestic menaces, but Muslims were an international menace, by the way. So that's how they read Muslims, as they have Assad Green speaks in his book, The Fear of Islam, as demographical menaces, as cultural menaces, and as religious menaces. There are three menaces that Muslims incorporate, and the own body of the Muslim is seen as a problem and is criminalized in the idea of law and order that Jason Stanley shows in his work, How Fascism Works. And returning to the conclusions, it can be said that events involving the international Muslim community have local impacts in Brazil, mainly on social networks, and occasionally in attacks on practitioners of the faith, mainly women. So it's common to have Muslim women telling about the aggressions that they suffer on the public transportation and the public spaces. And it's something that I don't remember the panelists that told that before, but it's to think about Islamophobia in Brazil. I think that we must thinking about gender, class, and race. These three aspects are fundamental to think about the racism and the Islamophobia, about the xenophobia and Islamophobia in Brazil. The xenophobia, the problems with immigrants, this perception of immigrants as a problems also come together with the Muslims as problems. So it's something that on our researches we must talk about that. We have two groups in Brazil. One group is Right Wing de São Paulo. It's an organization based on the state of São Paulo that have a right-wing, extremely right-wing orientation, and they made an act against the law of immigration in Brazil. And we have another group whose the name is Martyrs Generation. The motto of the group is yes to Bible, no to Constitution. and they burn Quran. They have some signs telling that the Quran is a manual of murder and this kind of thing. As someone took as an exercise, if you substitute the name Muslim to the word Jew in the publications of this group, you have a process. They must be arrested. But in Brazil, it's something normalized to talk against Muslims. And it should disable the presence of social agents from the political spectrum of the right and extreme right, identified as Christians and nationalists. Muslims are characterized in a similar way to George Agamben's Homo Sacer, individuals unworthy of being considered as human beings. Orientalist representations of xenophobic nature were also apprehended in profusion in a process that we identified as Islamophobia by cultural translation. So Islamophobia as bicultural translation is the concept that I'm trying to create with my thesis to analyze, because as I told you, we don't have big Muslim communities. We don't have in Brazil. We don't have acts with this community. So all most of the representations on Islam in Brazil come from other countries. Come from the source was from other countries. So in the process of translation, they took them and show the Muslims of Brazil as a menace, having a network, an international network, to spread values that are against the Brazilian, against Brazilian country and against Brazilian culture. So it's in this aspect that I've been researching, and the papers that I published in the past. I took some concepts from other researchers, like from the randomized report, and applied to publications in Twitter, and saw that we have the same scheme, the same framework to the Islamophobia Publications Act that they show on social media. And it's as I told, unfortunately, we have a lot to research on Islamophobia in Brazil, even if we don't have this big community. But we are doing the first report on how Muslims perceive the Islamophobia they suffer in Brazil. And something that I can anticipate for you is that we have 80% of the Muslim women that answered the report told that they suffer Islamophobia on social network or in public transportations or in public space, and 60% of the Muslim men have these problems also. And it's a phenomenon that we must analyze and make researches. And it's a pleasure to show a little off about what I'm doing on my doctorate. And I think that the time was up. So I thank you a lot for the patience and for listening to me, and apologize for any errors that I made. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Felipe, for a very interesting presentation. And it is interesting, and of course also unfortunate, that one can recognize parallels in Islamophobic rhetoric and actions in disparate parts of the world. So at this time, I'd like to encourage attendees to type in their questions in the Q&A. I do want to mention that Dr. Khaled Zeki is thanking you for an excellent presentations. So thank you to the panel. At this time, actually, before we turn to the typed questions, I do want to see if there are questions among the panelists. So those of you who were just presenting, do you have questions for each other or any comments?
I have a question for Caleb Lucas.
Yes.
And what I was just wondering was, and I don't know if you found any, I'm writing a paper about the incel movement and the connection between, there's a lot of conversation within incel chatter making like these spurious connections to Islam when really there's no connection whatsoever. And I'm wondering whether in your research you found any of those connections, and also identifying why it was happening when Islam has nothing to do with incel, like they're two completely different movements. And yet, you talk about 4chan and some of these like fringe networking, and there's a lot of conversation about how we need to be like the Muslims and how they treat their women, essentially.
That's really interesting, and I appreciate you sharing that and for the question. That's interesting. Yeah, it's not something that we look for specifically. There is just a lot of it sounds like you've seen, unfortunately, a lot of just overt racism and connections. The sort of not the right word, scapegoating and spurious connections to the sort of trends we observe, or that bigots and racists will argue for, connections to crime, terrorist upticks, economic woes, things like this. But I think, at least, again, it's not something we sought out, but the sort of connections to like conspiracies beyond the sort of Q family of conspiracies, I don't know, it's something that I've seen, and but I would be really interested to see your work on that. That sounds very interesting.
Yeah, I was hoping you might have had. It's not like I don't love reading about it. So I was hoping you might have done something.
Yep, it's difficult.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Other panelists?
I'm interested, Dr. Lucas, if and I don't know if this is something you've thought about or looked at, but it sounds like you just have a lot of organizations. Have you seen, or do you think you'll see any sort of like between organization like variation in the sorts of biases that are embedded in the surveys? Do you think there's like, and it seems like maybe it's particularly relevant, in this context, groups of organizations that sort of have an agenda, and others that really try to do a better job in this regard. Is that something you've observed, or you think you'll find?
Well, I think it's something that I think is going to require a little bit more research to have an exact answer. But one of the things I think I could say, based on what we have so far, and is that, of course, different polling organizations tend towards certain topics. And of course, certain organizations have, especially in the think tank world, have their points of view. And so, for example, the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, being a kind of generally recognized pro-Israeli think tank, tends to emphasize polls on the Arab-Israeli conflict, whereas the Pew surveys are tending to look at how the United States is evaluated. And so, and whereas Zogby, the Arab Center in DC, and their home organization in Doha are, tend to have kind of a more pan-Arab, pro-Arab point of view in their surveys. And so I think this is where, what I could say is, from what we've been looking at so far, that's where that variation would be coming from, is topics and such. And it is interesting that I think, as I was poking through the data, how some things are perhaps misleading. And I think we had we got called the Ben Shapiro example, is not that we picked up reportage on his commentary and misuse of polling, but rather what we picked up was the Polyfact dispelling of his misuse of polling. And so therefore kind of looking at how he abused the Pew data and kind of extrapolated wrongly from the math. And so therefore, what was interesting is that the dispelling of that was being picked up, not the original source. Now, of course, that was perhaps because we were not looking into social media or, YouTube. And I was kind of surprised at how little Fox News reporting we had picked up. And so I'm some of this may be artifacts of data collection, but I do think that, in a lot of ways, the mainstream media sources are attempting to be neutralistic. So I think, that's kind of our first conclusion on that. So, so thanks for the question.
Thank you. That's really.
Thank you for that. We do have a couple of questions in the Q&A, but first I'd like to see if there are other questions from the panelists. Okay, so in that case, let's proceed to the, oh, Felipe, did you raise your hand? Oh, no, maybe it was, okay, my bad. So let's actually go to the Q&A. So this question from Dr. Khaleda Zaki to Dr. Ferozuddin. What would be your general message to parents of South Asian Muslim youth in light of the recent family murder-suicide by two young brothers in the Houston area? And the focus here is possible causes of such violence. I wonder if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, I saw that question and I didn't know what this, I looked up the murder. And so I guess for me, really not really knowing why they did what they did, I guess really my only advice is, which I have found, is the lack of mental health support within Muslim immigrant communities, which I think is perhaps a function of being immigrant community as opposed to being Muslim and immigrant. I think it's just an immigrant mentality that there's a lack of mental health support. So, I mean, I think that's what's lacking is how to identify problems and then moving forward in providing that support once it's been identified. As much, because I don't know what the reason was for the murder, suicide, the initial.
Yes, and speaking of mental health, of course, we have here at Michigan State, Dr. Farha Abbasi, who was involved in something called Muslim mental health. And now we have a question here, and I think I may mispronounce the name, so I apologize, but it looks like Thamir or Tamir Mahfoudi. A question to Professor Felipe. Is there in Brazil, in the Brazilian case, maybe a tendency or an initiative to teach Islam in public schools in order to integrate the Muslim community and to avoid Islamophobia?
I remember panelists yesterday that talk about when people knows Muslims, they become less, they have less prejudice against us. But the main person that talk about Islam in a family, for example, is the person that becomes Muslim, because we have few organizations here. We have as I told, the Muslim Federation of Brazil that prints books and distribute Quran and other books from a Wahhabi perspective, and it's a problem. We have an initiative of Masjid al-Wadud that put themselves as traditional Islam, and they have a YouTube channel that was growing. And we have the CGL, which is the Center for the Divulgation of Islam in Latin America, but they have a more, they actuate more in Spanish language countries, there is in other countries than Brazil, because it's we have higher initiatives of educations. We have the Institute of Latin America, the Latin American Institute on Islamic Studies, that began to do this formation of Islamic conferences for schools, but all the projects were small and other projects have a few cases. We have problems to talk about Islam in schools because they see us religious preaching. They don't see that as a means of understanding the world they live. And it's common to people to call me or other Muslims that I know to talk to students in the last years and for the college's exams. But it's very hard, and it's something that don't happen in a systematic way. So we have only isolated initiatives, and it's something that I hope that someday, inshallah, we must organize and do this as a community. And it's a challenge for the Brazilian community, for sure. It's a real challenge.
Thank you, Felipe. We actually don't have any additional questions in the Q&A. Let me actually ask the other presenters from previous days if they have any questions. Maybe they can raise their hands or just unmute their mic and just ask away.
Well, more than a question, I want to thank Dr. Sabah for the Salience discovery. I'm already following them in Instagram. And thanks to everybody. I think it was also interesting what Professor Caleb showed, that when Islamophobia discourse tends to descend, so the anti-Semitic discourse tends to rise. But still, I think the damage is done. It's already, Islamophobia is already there everywhere. As I said yesterday, in Mexico, there is more ignorance about Muslim culture, Arab culture, but still this narrative has been doing damage to these people. And usually when there's something going on, like the Bataclan attack in Paris or something like that, so they are the Muslims are attacked also here in Mexico, not killed yet. I hope that will not happen, but they are attacked. So I think it's really important to follow all these questions, because maybe the term is new, but the phenomena is not new at all, I think. Yeah.
Thank you for that, Dr. Vilches. Any responses to this? How about other questions from previous presenters?
Actually, if you don't mind, I did notice there was a question in the Q&A earlier that's no longer there, and I was kind of waiting for it to be asked. That the
was this the question by John Goodman?
The salience question.
Yes, yeah. So yeah, John Goodman asked a very good question about the use of salience in the presentation by Caleb and Nazita. And Caleb actually typed in a response. So the question was, the word salience does a lot of heavy lifting in the second presentation. How do you define and measure it? Caleb says, and Caleb, feel free to elaborate, but here he says, thanks for the question. We think of group salience as the amount of attention that the news media and elite politicians provide a group. We measure using all available US newspapers on LexisNexis, scaled keyword counts, and trends of search terms on Google, scaled searches. We provide some additional evidence using political tweets and descriptions of the US during the time of the study. And Caleb, feel free to add anything to that.
You took the words right out of my mouth.
Yeah, I figured I'd just read it just to move things along.
But I guess that one, brings up another measurement question of, I guess I noticed it was scaled at, and I wasn't sure the exact measurement of scaling and normalization. Is that to all text or to just, I guess, hate text?
Sure. So the search terms are scaled to all Google searches, and that's something that we don't have the backend data to. Google provides the method in which they scale, not the complete data they used to produce the scale. And so then we produce the scale of the using the keywords within mainstream news reporting, and those are the two. I think the two things I shared today, regarding salience, and we just track a couple Twitter accounts and sort of key political figures, just track their mentions of these groups over time, and then again provide some sort of descriptive analysis as well.
Thank you for that, Caleb. Would others like to ask something? We do have a question in the Q&A, but let's see first if we have any other questions. Okay, so in the Q&A, we have Professor Salah Hassan, and he has two questions. First, for Felipe, do you have good census data on the racial or socioeconomic data on Brazilian Muslims? are most Muslims in Brazil, quote unquote, white, of Mideast origin and affluent? You may have addressed this question. And so why don't we address that first, and then I'll take the next question.
Okay, thanks for the question. No, we don't have a census data on this because I wonder that because you have some dispute, there's some kinds of dispute between the organizations because they have funding from other countries, from Iraq, from Egypt, from Saudi Arabia, and if you have a precise number of Muslims, you don't have the same funding from these countries. And it's an hypothesis because we don't have this kind of census. Even if Islam is in Brazil for centuries, we don't have this the census, and no organization done this research before. So it's an initiative of few researchers, and the gracias, as Professor Muhammad Khalil told the group that I belong, we are taking the first initiative to do a report on Muslims in Brazil. So, and it's very difficult with the researchers in Brazil with this national populist and negationist, obscurantist government of Jair Bolsonaro. It's kind of worse than Trump, not a lot of issues. So it's been a challenge to do this research. And about the racial profile of the Muslims, there are a few from white Muslims in Brazil, and as someone becomes Muslim, it's not read anymore as a white person, and it's some kind of curious because, as I told before, they see the people see us some people that come from other countries. They think that Islam is a place. They even used to ask, do you come from Islam? As Islam is a geographical place. It's curious because there's so much disinformation on Islam, and you have some ethnic divisions. You have a masjid for Lebanese, a masjid for Africans in Brazil, and we have a Pakistani masjid, and we have some experiences like in Foz do Iguaçu and Manaus, that these good cities there are mosques that have Shia and Sunni together, that pray together, that bathe the khutbah together, and it's a cool experience because the community is so small that they join themselves. So some ethnic differences are erased, so they can open a mosque by themselves. And in other cases, this ethnic differences is highlighted, as in the case of the African mosque, the Africans mosque. It has this nickname, Africans mosque, but the name is Masjid Bilal al-Hagashi, because there are the big community of Lebanese and a big community of Africans that took the khutbah in the same mosque, but there are the people felt uncomfortable, and they split in two groups and open two mosques, and it's a sad situation, but it's something that happens. We have a kind of anarchical Islam in Brazil, and it's as I told, it's a curious situation, and I hope that more descriptions and more studies from them must show off. We have Paulo Ilu. He's a researcher. He's an anthropologist from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. He has some published papers and chapters about the subject of Brazilian communities. But as I told you, it's a small community and don't have a big organization. The federations, the organizations like FAMBRAS have a perspective to work with halal meat. Okay, half of the meat that Brazil exports have the halal certification, and probably it's the main concern of the Muslims organization. It's not education, it's not to make a census, it's not to make research, it's not to fund the researchers, it's to export meat and to perpetuate an status quo of an Arabic elite, and take the Muslims by themselves in most of the situations.
Thank you, Felipe. Well, it is now time for closing reflections. But first, I do want to sneak in this really quick last question for Caleb from Professor Hassan. how do you explain the decline in anti-Muslim activity post Unite the Right?
Sure thing. I'll try to be brief. Thank you so much for the question. So I think first, we think that anti-Muslim activity decreased after Unite the Right because of the decreased group salience of Muslims. Mentions of Muslims decreased in the national news, attention from the public appeared to decrease slightly before and then during that decline. So that decrease occurred before the decrease in hate crimes. So I think that sort of precipitated it. And second, and the thing I didn't have time to talk about today, we also think that some violent extremists shifted their attention to Jews from Muslims because of the increased group salience of Jews sort of nationally. We have some evidence that the same posters who were promoting anti-Muslim rhetoric when hate crimes against Muslims were particularly high shifted to promoting anti-Jewish rhetoric. And that was after the Unite the Right riot. So then we think sort of concurrently then there's an overall decrease because salience decreased, but then some of the group individuals who were promoting that rhetoric and targeting Muslims with hate crimes or violence offline shifted to targeting Jews. Those sort of two trends then produced, we think, or we have evidence that decrease after the Unite the Right riot.
Thank you so much, Caleb. And now it is time for closing remarks and reflections. I do want to thank this last panel for an outstanding panel, for outstanding presentations. So a big virtual round of applause for our panel. So now we move to the closing remarks and reflections. Each year we at the Muslim Studies program at Michigan State, we solicit proposals. We ask our faculty to send us their proposals for the theme for next year's conference. And when we received Professor Nazita Lajevardi's proposal, we immediately recognized its importance. Islamophobia is truly a global phenomenon. And it was interesting in these presentations to see the global nature of this phenomenon. So at this time, I'd like to invite Professor Lajevardi to offer some closing remarks. And then I'd like to ask those who have presented to offer some reflections if they have any. No pressure, but I'd like first to turn it over to Professor Lajevardi.
Thank you, Mohammed. And thank you all for being here and sharing in this space over the past 2 days. I think we've all learned a great deal from each other. It's amazing that we can all be in this space from different intellectual approaches, different substantive approaches, different methodological approaches, different theoretical approaches, but all within the same vein, right? We are all trying to understand, I think, a broader question of what is the role of global Islamophobia in the media? How does that work? What kinds of media? There's so many different forms that are relevant, stemming from entertainment media to news media to social media. And I think as we move forward and we enter this new era of media consumption, where now we're not just on just watching news media, and now that we have so much more access to different types of entertainment with just streaming functions and even social media, it becomes all the more necessary for us to pay attention to these questions. And I think that the research that was highlighted here today has not only provided a historical overview of how that how media has racialized and hurt the Muslim population worldwide, but how it's done so in increasing in volume. And so I think that's definitely a lesson that we can all take away from this experience. I want to thank all of you for being a part of this conference from all over the world. I don't think that this is something that we treasure enough about Zoom, but that we can all be together for 2 days in this space, in this link, in this forum is truly remarkable and is a blessing of its own. And so I guess in closing, I thank you all. I thank you all for your wisdom, for sharing your knowledge, for being here, for celebrating each other, for sharing, for being vulnerable, for learning from one another, for all of us just engaging in this space. I think this is a very unique opportunity, and it's a rare one where we can feel safe in doing so. And so thank you all for helping to maintain that level of safety, respect, and community. I think that's been very wonderful. You know, for those of you who celebrate Ramazan, I wish you all a Ramazan Kareem. I wish we were all together and that we could enjoy an iftar together, but please know that you will all be in my prayers, and thank you so very much.